Everyone was called by name, except me. Danny blinked and leaned closer. "I'm sorry," he said gently. "What did you say?" The girl looked up at him. A small violin case rested across her lap, and both her hands held it carefully, as if it were something that could break. "Everyone was called by name," she repeated. "Except me." Daniel glanced toward the stage. The talent showcase at Ridgeway Academy was still in full swing. On stage, a boy was finishing a piano piece. Daniel looked back at the girl. "Hold on," he said quietly. "How do you know everyone was called?" The girl lifted the folded program from her lap. "I counted," she said. Daniel raised his eyebrows. "You counted?" She nodded seriously. "There are 16 performers," she explained. "I checked the list." Her finger pointed to the paper. "I listened to every name." Daniel took the program from her small hands. The paper was slightly wrinkled from being held tightly for so long. At the very top of the list, he read, "Annie Johnson Violin Performance." Daniel looked back at her. "You're Annie?" She nodded. "Yes, sir." Daniel looked at the stage again. The MC stepped forward with a practiced smile. "Let's give Ethan another round of applause," she said brightly. More clapping. Then she looked down at her clipboard. "And next up we have..." Another child walked onto the stage. Daniel looked back at Annie. "And they haven't called your name yet?" Annie shook her head. "No, sir. Are you sure it hasn't happened already? Maybe when you stepped out?" Annie immediately shook her head again, more firmly this time. "I've been here the whole time." Daniel studied her expression. There was no confusion in her voice. The stage lights flickered as the next performance began, a young girl singing with a backing track. Annie sat quietly, listening. Then suddenly her eyes shifted past Daniel's shoulder. "Oh," she whispered. Daniel turned slightly. The MC was walking down the side aisle, carrying a clipboard and speaking quietly to one of the stage assistants. Annie stood up quickly, clutching her violin case. She stepped toward the woman politely. "Excuse me, ma'am," Annie said. "Karen Mitchell." The MC slowed but didn't quite stop. Annie spoke clearly. "My name is Annie Johnson. I think I'm first on the list. Could you please check when it's my turn to perform?" Karen barely glanced down. Her smile stayed fixed in the polite expression adults sometimes use when they want to end a conversation quickly. "We're in the middle of the program right now," she said. "Go back to your seat and wait." But Karen was already moving again. "We'll call you if needed," she added dismissively as she walked past. Annie stood still for a moment. Then she slowly returned to her chair beside Daniel. The girl sat down again and placed the violin case back on her lap. For a few seconds, she said nothing. The singer on stage finished her performance, and the audience clapped warmly. Daniel watched Annie carefully. Finally, she turned toward him again. Her voice was quiet but certain. "You see?" Daniel leaned slightly closer. "What do you mean?" Annie pointed to the program. "They keep calling everyone else." Another name was announced on stage. A boy ran forward holding a trumpet. Annie looked at Daniel again. "I told you," she said. "They called everyone." She paused. "Except me." Daniel looked down at the program again. His eyes moved slowly across the page, and that's when he noticed it. Across Annie Johnson's name, right at the top of the list, someone had drawn a line. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. He glanced back toward the stage. The trumpet performance had begun. Parents were smiling again, completely unaware of the small conversation happening just a few rows away. Daniel looked back at Annie. "How long have you been waiting?" he asked. Annie thought for a moment. "A long time." Her mother, sitting beside her, spoke quietly. "We got here early," she said. She didn't want to miss her turn. Daniel looked at the woman. "You're her mother?" "Yes," she said. "Angela Johnson." Daniel nodded. "Daniel Whitmore." Angela's expression shifted slightly as she recognized the name, but Daniel's attention had already returned to the program. The red line across Annie's name bothered him more than he expected. He crouched slightly so he could speak directly to her again. "You brought your violin because you practiced for this, right?" Annie nodded. "Yes, sir." "And you were ready to play tonight?" Another nod. Daniel closed the program slowly. On stage, the trumpet player finished his song, and the audience clapped again. The MC stepped forward with her microphone. "And next we have..." Another name. Another child. Daniel looked down at Annie. She was watching the stage carefully, still waiting, still believing her name might come next. Daniel felt something inside him settle into place. Not anger, a decision. He stood slowly. Then he handed the program back to Annie. "Well," he said calmly, looking toward the stage again. Let's find out why. Daniel Whitmore remained standing for a moment after handing the program back to Annie. And that was wonderful, Karen Mitchell said into the microphone. Let's hear it again for Daniel Brooks. More applause filled the auditorium. Karen glanced down at the clipboard in her hand. And next we have Sophia Langley performing a ballet piece. A young girl hurried onto the stage in pink slippers. Music began to play softly through the speakers. Daniel's attention, however, had moved away from the stage. He looked down at Annie again. The girl had not moved. She sat very straight in her seat, violin case resting across her lap exactly as it had been for the past hour. The only difference now was the quiet way she watched the stage, not with excitement, with patience, the kind of patience that didn't belong on a girl's face. If this moment touched your heart, please take a second to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and tell us where you are watching from. And if you believe every child deserves a fair chance, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us for more stories that remind us why kindness and justice still matter. Daniel leaned slightly closer. You're still waiting, he said quietly. Annie nodded. Yes, sir. You really think they'll call you soon? Annie considered the question seriously. They should, she said. My name is First. Her mother, Angela Johnson, offered a small, tired smile beside her. She practiced for 3 weeks, Angela said gently. Every evening after school. Annie glanced quickly toward her mother, embarrassed by the attention. Daniel smiled faintly. What song are you playing tonight? He asked. Minuet number 3, Annie answered. The name surprised him. That's not easy, he said. Annie shrugged lightly. My teacher says if you play it slowly first, it becomes easier. Daniel chuckled quietly. That's good advice for a lot of things. On stage, the ballet performance ended with a small spin and a bow. Applause again. Karen Mitchell stepped forward. Beautiful work, Sophia. Daniel's eyes returned to the program again. 16 performers. They had already passed the halfway point. Yet Annie had never been called. He looked back toward the stage assistant standing near the curtain. The woman held a headset and occasionally whispered instructions to students waiting backstage. Daniel noticed something else. Near the curtain stood a girl holding a violin. She looked about 8 years old. Blonde hair tied neatly in a ribbon. A confident posture. The girl spoke quietly to Karen Mitchell as the MC stepped off the stage during the applause. Karen bent slightly toward her. Daniel saw the resemblance immediately. Same eyes. Same smile. Mother and daughter. Angela noticed Daniel looking. That's Lily Mitchell, she said quietly. The host's daughter? Angela nodded. She's performing violin tonight too. Daniel glanced back down at Annie's program, then back to Lily, then again at the red line drawn across Annie Johnson's name. Something about the situation settled uncomfortably in his mind. Another performance began. A boy singing a country song. Parents clapped along softly. Daniel leaned down again. Annie, he said gently. Yes, sir. If you were called next, would you still want to play? The question surprised her. She looked down at her violin case, then back up. Yes. No hesitation. Even after waiting this long? Yes, sir. Daniel studied her face. There was no anger there. No frustration. Just the quiet determination of someone who had practiced something carefully and still hoped she might get the chance to show it. Daniel nodded slowly. That's good, he said. On stage, the song ended. Karen Mitchell returned to the microphone again. And now we're moving into the final portion of tonight's showcase. Daniel's eyes lifted. Final portion. That meant only a few performers remained. Karen looked down at her clipboard. And next we have Lily Mitchell performing a violin solo. Applause immediately grew louder than before. Several parents near the front leaned forward with interest. Angela's eyebrows lifted slightly. Daniel noticed Annie's reaction. She didn't speak, but her eyes moved to the stage. Lily Mitchell walked confidently into the spotlight. Her violin gleamed under the lights. She lifted the instrument smoothly to her shoulder. The room grew quiet. The music began. Lily played well, confident, technically strong. Parents nodded approvingly. Daniel watched Annie instead of the stage. The girl listened carefully. Her fingers moved slightly along the neck of her violin case as if following the notes. When the piece ended, the applause was enthusiastic. Karen Mitchell clapped proudly as her daughter bowed. Wonderful performance. Lily smiled and walked off stage. Karen returned to the microphone again. And our next performer tonight. Daniel straightened slightly. Surely now. Surely Annie's turn had to come. Karen looked down at the clipboard again. And next, we have Tyler Jenkins, with a guitar solo. Daniel blinked. Tyler Jenkins hurried onto the stage with his guitar. Daniel slowly turned his head toward Annie. The girl hadn't moved, but something had changed. Her fingers were now holding the violin case more tightly. Daniel crouched again beside her. "Did you hear that?" he asked softly. Annie nodded once. "That wasn't your name," he said. "No, sir. And you're still first on the list?" Annie unfolded the program again. "Yes." She showed him the page once more. Annie Johnson Violin Performance. Still at the top, still crossed out. Daniel's jaw tightened. He glanced toward the stage again where Tyler began strumming his guitar. Then his eyes moved to the side of the stage. Karen Mitchell stood just behind the curtain now, chatting with two parents while occasionally glancing toward the audience. Daniel stood slowly. Angela noticed. "You're really going to say something, aren't you?" she asked quietly. Daniel looked back at her. His voice remained calm. "Yes." Angela hesitated. "We don't want to make trouble," she said carefully. Daniel shook his head slightly. "This isn't trouble." He looked down at Annie again. The girl was still watching the stage, still waiting, still hoping her name might finally come next. Daniel placed one hand gently on the back of the empty seat beside her. Then he said quietly, "A child shouldn't have to sit here wondering if her name was erased." Angela didn't answer. She simply watched him. On stage, the guitar performance reached its final chords. Applause rose once more. Karen Mitchell stepped back toward the microphone. And next we have, Daniel Whitmore began walking down the aisle. Parents moved slightly aside as he passed. Most didn't recognize him yet, but they noticed the quiet confidence in the way he moved. Daniel stopped just beside the stage. Karen glanced up. For a brief second, she looked confused. Then she noticed the banner above the stage, Whitmore Foundation Talent Showcase. Her smile faded slightly. Daniel spoke calmly. "Excuse me," he said. Karen adjusted the microphone. "Yes?" Daniel held up the folded program. "I believe someone was skipped." Karen blinked. "What do you mean?" Daniel opened the paper slowly. His finger rested on the first name, Annie Johnson. Karen's expression changed, very slightly, but Daniel saw it, and suddenly he was certain of something. This wasn't a mistake. Karen forced a polite smile. "Oh, that." Daniel waited. Karen glanced toward the audience, then back at him. "We're running a tight schedule tonight," she said. Daniel's voice remained calm. "There's still time." Karen's smile stiffened. "We'll see." Daniel looked past her toward the side aisle where Annie still sat holding her violin. Then he looked back at Karen Mitchell. "We should probably fix this now," he said quietly. The music for the next performer had already begun, but something else had just started too. Karen Mitchell realized the man standing in front of her wasn't just another parent. He was the man whose name hung above the stage, and he was no longer sitting quietly in the audience. Karen Mitchell held the microphone in one hand and the clipboard in the other, but her attention was now completely fixed on the man standing beside the stage. For a brief moment, the practiced confidence in her posture flickered, not gone, just shaken. Daniel Whitmore stood calmly in front of her, the folded program still open in his hand. Behind him, the guitar performance continued. Tyler Jenkins was halfway through his song, strumming nervously under the warm lights while his parents filmed proudly from the front row. But a quiet shift had already begun in the room. People nearby had started noticing. A tall man in a dark jacket speaking directly to the host. Karen forced a smile that looked professional from a distance but strained up close. "Mr. Whitmore," she said carefully. She had recognized him. Of course she had. It was impossible not to. His foundation's name hung across the stage in letters nearly 3 feet tall. Daniel's voice remained calm. "There's still a performer missing." Karen glanced briefly toward the audience, then back at him. "We have a schedule," she replied softly. "These events are very carefully planned." Daniel nodded. "I understand schedules." He tapped the program lightly with his finger. "But the first name on your list never performed." Karen's jaw tightened. Behind them, Tyler finished his song, and the room filled with applause again. Karen immediately lifted the microphone. "Let's give Tyler a wonderful round of applause." More clapping. She looked down at the clipboard again, and next, Daniel spoke quietly, but firmly. "Karen." The use of her name stopped her mid-sentence. The microphone lowered slightly. Karen turned toward him. "Yes?" Daniel held the program open so she could see it clearly. "Annie Johnson." The name hung in the air between them. Karen's eyes flickered toward the paper for a split second. Then she gave a quick, dismissive shrug. "Oh, that." Daniel watched her carefully. "Oh, that?" he repeated. Karen leaned slightly closer to him so the microphone wouldn't catch her voice. "That student will perform later," she said quietly. Daniel glanced toward the stage. "How much later?" Karen didn't answer. Instead, she stepped forward and spoke into the microphone again. "And next we have Emma Clark performing a vocal solo." A girl hurried onto the stage. Music began, but now several parents were looking away from the performance. Their attention had shifted to the quiet conversation happening near the stage. Daniel looked back at Karen. "You told her to sit down and wait." Karen's smile thinned. "I manage the order of performers." Daniel nodded slowly. "Yet the printed order says she goes first." Karen crossed her arms slightly. "Sometimes adjustments are necessary." Daniel studied her expression. Then he asked the question directly. "Why was Annie Johnson removed?" Karen's eyes hardened. "She wasn't removed." Daniel raised the program again. The red line across Annie's name was impossible to miss. Karen followed his gaze. For the first time, she seemed irritated. "That marking doesn't mean anything." Daniel didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced toward the audience. Across the room, Annie still sat in the same chair, the violin case, still resting carefully across her lap, still waiting, still watching the stage, still believing her turn might come. Daniel turned back to Karen. "She's been sitting there for over an hour." Karen shrugged. "There are many students tonight." "That's not an answer." Karen's voice cooled. "Mr. Whitmore, with respect, this is a school event. These situations are handled by staff." Daniel tilted his head slightly. "Yes," he said. "They should be." The singer finished her song. Applause rose again. Karen quickly stepped forward to the microphone. "Beautiful performance." But now the audience's attention was divided. Several parents in the nearby rows had begun whispering. One man leaned toward his wife. "Is that Whitmore?" His wife squinted toward the stage. "I think it is." Karen shuffled her papers again. "And next we have..." Daniel stepped slightly closer. The microphone picked up his voice this time. "Before the next performer," he said calmly. Karen froze. The room grew noticeably quieter. Parents turned in their seats. Daniel's tone never rose, but there was a firmness in it that was impossible to ignore. "There is one name that hasn't been called." Karen lowered the microphone slowly. Her eyes flashed. "Mr. Whitmore," she whispered sharply. "This is not the time." Daniel glanced at the banner above the stage. "Whitmore Foundation Talent Showcase." Then he looked back at her. "It seems like exactly the time." Karen's voice dropped further. "You're interrupting the program." Daniel shook his head slightly. "No." He turned his head and looked toward the audience again. "Your program interrupted someone else." Karen followed his gaze. Her eyes landed on Annie. For the first time that evening, the host seemed genuinely uncomfortable. Daniel spoke quietly. "She asked you about her performance." Karen didn't reply. "She told you her name." Still silence. "And you told her to wait." Karen's lips pressed together. The singer's applause faded completely now. The auditorium had grown unusually still. Even the students backstage were peeking around the curtain to see what was happening. Karen tried once more to regain control. She lifted the microphone again. "Let's continue with our next." Daniel gently reached out and lowered the microphone. The movement wasn't aggressive, just decisive. The audience gasped softly. Karen stared at him. "You can't do that." Daniel's voice remained calm. "I think I can." Karen folded her arms. "You're making a scene." Daniel glanced around the room. Rows of parents watching, teachers whispering near the side doors, children peeking from backstage. Then he looked back at her. "No," he said quietly. "You made the scene." Karen's expression darkened. "What exactly do you want?" Daniel pointed toward the back row. "I want you to call her name." Karen followed his gaze again. The girl with the violin. Still sitting. Still waiting. Karen exhaled slowly. "You don't understand how these events work." Daniel's eyes sharpened slightly. "Then explain it to me." Karen hesitated. For the first time, she seemed unsure what to say. Daniel didn't raise his voice, but when he spoke again, the entire room heard it. "Because from where I'm standing," he held up the program once more. "It looks like someone erased a child." The silence that followed was heavier than any applause, and every person in the auditorium now understood something unusual was happening. Daniel Whitmore had stopped the show, and he wasn't finished speaking. For a few seconds after Daniel Whitmore finished speaking, no one in the auditorium moved. The silence had a strange weight to it. Parents who had come expecting a simple evening of music and applause now found themselves leaning forward in their seats. Some lowered their phones. Others glanced at the stage, then at the banner above it, then back at the man standing beside the microphone. Karen Mitchell felt every pair of eyes in the room. Her posture stiffened. "This is inappropriate," she said under her breath. Daniel's expression didn't change. "What's inappropriate?" he replied calmly. "Is letting a child believe she was invisible." Karen tried to keep her voice steady. "You're misunderstanding the situation." Daniel tilted his head slightly. "Then help me understand." Karen hesitated. Behind them, a stage assistant whispered nervously into her headset. A few students backstage had gathered near the curtain, peeking through the gap to see what was happening. The program had stopped, and everyone knew it. Karen exhaled slowly. "There are many students tonight," she said. "Sometimes adjustments need to be made." Daniel nodded once. "I'm sure they do." He lifted the program again. "But adjustments don't usually involve crossing out the first name on the list." Karen's eyes flickered again toward the red line. Then, she looked toward the audience. Whispers had begun spreading through the room. "What's going on? Who's Annie Johnson? Why didn't she play?" Karen leaned toward Daniel again. "You're making this larger than it needs to be." Daniel glanced toward the back of the auditorium. Annie was still sitting in the same chair. Her violin case rested carefully across her lap. But now she wasn't watching the stage. She was watching him. Daniel looked back at Karen. "She's been waiting this entire time." Karen's voice hardened. "And now she can wait a few more minutes." Daniel shook his head slowly. "No." Karen's patience snapped slightly. "You're interrupting the event." Daniel spoke quietly. The event interrupted her. Karen stared at him. "You're not the one running this program." Daniel looked up at the banner again. "Whitmore Foundation Talent Showcase." Then he returned his gaze to her. "I funded it." Karen's mouth opened slightly. Several parents in the front rows murmured as they heard the exchange. Daniel's tone never changed. "And I didn't fund it so children could be quietly erased." Karen crossed her arms. "You're overreacting." Daniel gestured toward the stage. "No," he said. "I'm correcting something." Karen hesitated. The situation was slipping out of her control, and she knew it. Parents were now fully focused on the stage. Even the students waiting backstage had stopped whispering. Daniel stepped slightly closer to the microphone. His voice carried easily through the auditorium. "There's a young musician here tonight," he said. Every head turned. She arrived early. She practiced for weeks. Annie's mother sat frozen in her seat. Daniel continued. "And somehow, her name disappeared from the program." Karen stepped forward quickly. "Mr. Whitmore." Daniel raised one hand calmly. "Karen," he said quietly. "Let's solve this the simple way." Karen stared at him. "What way is that?" Daniel looked toward the back row again. Then he spoke clearly. "Call her name." Karen's expression hardened. "That's not how competitions work." Daniel answered immediately. "No." He paused. "That's how fairness works." The room remained silent. Karen looked toward the judges' table. They avoided her eyes. She glanced toward the teachers standing along the wall. None of them spoke. Daniel waited. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't angry. He was simply standing there. And that calm patience somehow made the moment even heavier. Karen realized something important then. If she refused now, the room would remember. Every parent, every student, every teacher. She inhaled slowly. Then she reached for the microphone. Her voice sounded tighter now. "There appears to have been a scheduling oversight." Soft murmurs moved through the audience. Karen flipped through her clipboard again. Then she read the name. Annie Johnson. Annie froze in her seat. For a moment she wasn't sure she had heard correctly. Her mother squeezed her hand. "Go," Angela whispered. Annie stood slowly. Her violin case felt heavier than before, but she carried it carefully down the aisle. As she walked toward the stage, people began clapping. Not loud applause, but warm, encouraging. The kind of applause adults give when they realize something important almost went wrong. Daniel stepped aside so Annie could reach the stairs. She climbed onto the stage. The lights seemed brighter from up there. Karen stepped back from the microphone. Her smile had returned, but it looked thinner now. "Whenever you're ready," she said. Annie walked to the center of the stage. For a moment she simply stood there, holding the violin. Daniel returned quietly to the aisle and watched from below. The auditorium had grown completely silent. Annie opened her violin case. She lifted the instrument carefully, placed it beneath her chin. Her bow hovered over the strings. For a moment her hands trembled. Daniel noticed. So did her mother. But then Annie took a slow breath, and the first note filled the room. Clear, soft, beautiful. The sound floated across the auditorium like sunlight through a window. Parents leaned forward. Teachers exchanged surprised glances. Even Karen Mitchell stopped moving. Annie played slowly at first, carefully, each note precise. But as the melody continued, something changed. Confidence returned. The music grew fuller, stronger. The final note lingered gently in the air before fading into silence. For one long second, nobody spoke. Then the applause began, louder than before. People stood, not everyone, but enough that the entire room felt different. Annie lowered her violin. Her eyes searched the audience. She found Daniel. He gave a small nod, not a grand gesture, just quiet approval. Annie smiled, and for the first time that evening, the program finally felt complete. The applause inside the Ridgeway Academy auditorium lasted longer than anyone expected. At first, it was polite, the kind of clapping parents give any child who stands bravely under bright lights. But as Annie's final note faded from the air, something deeper had settled over the room. People had heard the difference. Teachers near the wall exchanged glances. A few parents leaned toward each other. "That girl is good," one man whispered. "Very good," his wife replied. On stage, Annie lowered her violin slowly. Her fingers still rested lightly on the strings, as if the music might continue if she moved too quickly. Karen Mitchell stepped forward again, clapping with a smile that looked carefully reconstructed. "Wonderful performance," she said into the microphone, but her voice carried a stiffness that hadn't been there earlier in the evening. Annie gave a small bow the way her teacher had taught her. Then she carefully returned the violin to its case and walked off the stage. The applause continued as she descended the steps. Angela Johnson was already standing in the aisle waiting for her. The moment Annie reached her, Angela wrapped her arms around her daughter in a tight embrace. "You did beautifully," she whispered. Annie smiled shyly. "Did I play it too fast?" Angela laughed softly. "No, sweetheart." Daniel Whitmore watched the moment quietly from the side of the aisle. The judges at the front table were still talking among themselves, nodding thoughtfully. Karen Mitchell cleared her throat and turned back to the microphone. "And now we'll continue with our final performers this evening." The program resumed. Another student came forward, then another. But the energy in the room had changed. People were still watching the stage, but every few minutes someone's eyes drifted toward Annie, sitting beside her mother again, the girl who had almost been skipped. Daniel remained standing near the side aisle for a few seconds longer before returning slowly to his seat. As he passed the front row, one of the school administrators leaned toward him. "Mr. Whitmore," the man said quietly. Daniel stopped. "Yes, that was unexpected." Daniel gave a small nod. So was the red line across her name. The administrator said nothing. Daniel continued down the aisle. When he reached Annie and Angela, he stopped briefly. Angela looked up. "Thank you," she said softly. Daniel shook his head. "You don't need to thank me." He glanced at Annie. "You already did the hard part." Annie looked down at her violin case. "I was nervous," she admitted. Daniel smiled slightly. "That's part of playing music." Annie looked up again. "My teacher says if you're not nervous, it means you don't care." Daniel chuckled. "That teacher sounds wise." Annie nodded seriously. "She's very old." Angela covered a laugh with her hand. Daniel leaned slightly closer to Annie. "You sounded wonderful up there." Annie's eyes brightened. "Really?" "Yes." He gestured toward the front of the room. "I think everyone else agrees." Annie looked toward the judges' table. Two of the judges were still whispering to each other while occasionally glancing in her direction. Angela noticed Daniel watching them. "What happens now?" she asked. Daniel looked toward the stage where another performance had begun. "Now the program finishes," he said. Angela hesitated. "And the red line?" Daniel's expression grew thoughtful. "I'm still curious about that." On stage, a young boy began a drum performance that rattled the auditorium with energetic rhythm. The audience clapped along, but Daniel's attention had shifted again. He looked toward the side of the stage. Karen Mitchell stood there with her clipboard, speaking quietly to one of the teachers. Her expression looked strained now. The confident host from earlier in the evening had disappeared. Daniel stood slowly. Angela noticed. "You're not done, are you?" she asked. Daniel smiled faintly. "No." Angela sighed gently. "I had a feeling." Daniel stepped back toward the aisle. Annie looked up at him. "Are you going to talk to the microphone lady again?" she asked. Daniel paused. Then he nodded. "Yes." Annie thought for a moment. Then she said something that made him stop. I don't think she likes me. Daniel looked at her carefully. What makes you say that? Annie shrugged. She looked at me like my dog does when he sees broccoli. Daniel blinked. Angela tried not to laugh. Daniel crouched slightly so he was level with Annie again. Sometimes adults make mistakes, he said. Annie tilted her head. Even teachers? Yes. Even principals? Yes. Annie thought about that. Even billionaires? Daniel smiled. Especially billionaires. Annie seemed satisfied with that answer. Daniel stood again and continued walking toward the side of the stage. The drum performance ended in loud applause. Karen Mitchell clapped politely with the audience, but her eyes moved immediately toward Daniel as he approached. This time, she didn't wait for him to speak. Her voice was tight. What now? Daniel stopped beside the curtain. I'm curious about something. Karen, Seehith. Of course you are. Daniel held up the folded program again. This line. Karen's jaw tightened. We've already discussed that. No, Daniel said calmly. You explained that the schedule changed. Karen crossed her arms. That's correct. Daniel nodded. But you didn't explain why. Karen looked past him toward the audience. The program was still running, but she knew the room was no longer focused entirely on the stage. Daniel spoke quietly. Who crossed her name out? Karen didn't answer. Daniel waited. A moment passed, then another. Finally, Karen said, That isn't relevant. Daniel tilted his head slightly. It feels relevant. Karen leaned closer so her voice wouldn't carry. It was a judgment call. Daniel's eyes sharpened. Yours? Karen hesitated. Then she said something she immediately seemed to regret. She wasn't ready. Daniel blinked slowly. She just played. Karen looked irritated now. That doesn't mean she should have opened the program. Daniel glanced back toward the audience. Annie sat quietly beside her mother again, listening to the next performer. The violin case still rested on her lap. He looked back at Karen. So the best violinist in the room. He paused. Wasn't ready? Karen didn't respond. But Daniel noticed something. Her eyes flicked briefly toward the stage curtain again, toward the spot where Lily Mitchell stood talking with another student. Daniel followed the glance, and suddenly the pieces began to fit together. Karen Mitchell's eyes had moved only for a fraction of a second, but Daniel Whitmore noticed. People who spent years building companies learn to notice very small things, tiny hesitations, brief glances, moments when someone looked somewhere they shouldn't. Karen had looked toward the stage curtain. Daniel followed her gaze. Just behind the curtain stood a girl holding a violin. Blonde hair tied neatly in a ribbon, confident posture. Lily Mitchell, Karen's daughter. The realization settled quietly in Daniel's mind. He didn't react immediately. Instead, he looked back at Karen. She wasn't ready. Daniel repeated. Karen lifted her chin slightly. That's what I said. Daniel nodded slowly. Then he gestured toward the stage where another performance had just begun, a young boy attempting a complicated piano piece and missing half the notes. The audience clapped politely anyway. That student missed 3 chords in the first 10 seconds, Daniel said calmly. Karen shrugged. He's 8. Daniel looked at her again. And Annie? Karen crossed her arms. She's young too. Daniel let the silence stretch for a moment. Then he asked quietly, Who's judging the violin performances tonight? Karen hesitated. A panel. Who selected them? The school. Daniel nodded. And who decided the performance order? Karen didn't answer. Daniel tapped the program again. You did. Karen's patience was beginning to thin. Mr. Whitmore, I've already explained that adjustments were necessary. Daniel tilted his head slightly. Necessary for who? Karen opened her mouth, then closed it again. Daniel's eyes moved once more toward the stage curtain. Lily Mitchell stood there now speaking quietly with one of the judges. The judge leaned closer to listen, nodding with a friendly smile. Daniel looked back at Karen. That's your daughter. Karen's shoulders stiffened. Yes. She plays violin. Yes. And she's competing tonight. Karen exhaled slowly. This is none of your concern. Daniel didn't move. It became my concern when you crossed out Annie Johnson's name. Karen's voice dropped. You're making assumptions. Daniel shook his head gently. No. He gestured toward the stage. I'm observing. Karen glanced nervously toward the audience again. Parents were still watching the performances, but every now and then a few eyes drifted toward the side of the stage where the quiet conversation continued. Daniel spoke softly. How long has Lily been studying violin? Karen frowned. What does that matter? Who more me? Karen hesitated. 4 years. Daniel nodded. And Annie? Karen didn't respond. Daniel answered the question himself. About 2. Karen looked surprised. How would you know that? Daniel gave a small smile. I asked. Karen's jaw tightened again. That doesn't mean she belongs opening the showcase. Daniel's expression remained calm. No, he said. It just means she deserved the chance to play. Karen leaned closer. You don't understand how these competitions work. Daniel looked genuinely curious. Then explain it. Karen lowered her voice further. Parents donate money. Daniel waited. Students build reputations. Still, he waited. Karen continued. And sometimes, she said carefully, a program needs a certain structure. Daniel nodded slowly. Structure. Karen seemed relieved that he appeared to understand. Yes. Daniel glanced toward Lily again. Does that structure involve making sure your daughter wins? Karen's eyes flashed. That's insulting. Daniel shrugged slightly. It's also possible. Karen stepped back. You're out of line. Daniel held up the program again. The red line was out of line. Karen's patience finally cracked. She would have embarrassed herself. Daniel looked toward the audience again. Strange. Karen frowned. What is? Daniel gestured toward the room. Because that audience just stood and applauded her. Karen didn't reply. For a moment, the only sound between them was the distant piano performance finishing on stage. Applause rose again. Daniel studied Karen's face. Then he asked quietly, Did you watch her rehearsals? Karen hesitated. No. Did you hear her play before tonight? No. Daniel nodded once. So you crossed out her name without hearing her. Karen snapped back. I know talent. Daniel smiled faintly. Then tonight must have been surprising. Karen said nothing. The next performer was announced on stage. A young girl singing. Soft music floated through the auditorium. Daniel glanced once more toward the stage curtain. Lily was now adjusting her violin strings confidently. Karen noticed him watching. My daughter worked very hard, she said defensively. I'm sure she did, Daniel replied. Karen crossed her arms again. She deserves recognition. Daniel nodded. Probably. Karen looked relieved. But then Daniel added quietly, that recognition shouldn't require removing someone else. Karen's lips pressed together. You don't run school competitions. No. Daniel looked up at the banner again. But I fund them. Karen looked away. Daniel lowered his voice. I've built enough companies to recognize something when I see it. Karen looked back at him. What's that? Daniel tapped the program again. A decision made for the wrong reason. Karen said nothing. Daniel glanced toward Annie again. She sat quietly beside her mother, still holding the violin case carefully in her lap. Angela was speaking softly to her now, probably telling her how well she had played. Annie smiled. Daniel turned back to Karen. She almost went home believing she didn't belong on that stage. Karen's voice cooled. But she didn't. Daniel nodded slowly. That's true. Karen exhaled. So we're done here. Daniel looked thoughtful. Not quite. Karen frowned. What now? Daniel folded the program carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Now I'm curious about something else. Karen looked irritated. What? Daniel glanced toward the judges' table. They seemed surprised. Karen said nothing. Daniel continued. Which means they probably didn't approve removing Annie. Karen's expression stiffened. Daniel nodded slightly. So, the red line came from you. Karen looked away. Daniel's voice remained calm. And now the judges will need to decide something. Karen turned back sharply. What are you talking about? Daniel looked toward the stage again where the final performers were preparing. I'm talking about fairness. Karen laughed quietly. You think this changes the results? Daniel didn't smile. No. He paused. But it might change the conversation. Karen's eyes narrowed. What conversation? Daniel gestured toward the auditorium filled with parents, teachers, and students. The one that's about to happen when they ask why the best violinist tonight almost didn't play. Karen's face went pale. For the first time that evening, she seemed genuinely worried. Daniel Whitmore had not raised his voice once, but somehow the entire direction of the evening had already begun to shift. And Karen Mitchell was starting to realize that the red line she drew across Annie Johnson's name might not disappear as quietly as she expected. The final performance of the evening ended with a soft chord from the grand piano. For a moment, the auditorium held its breath. Then applause rose through the room, warm, appreciative, but tired in the way audiences often become after 2 hours of student performances. Parents stretched in their seats. Programs rustled. Someone coughed quietly near the back row. On stage, Karen Mitchell stepped forward again with her polished smile, microphone in hand. Let's give one more round of applause for all our talented students tonight. The audience clapped again, but the atmosphere in the room had changed. People weren't just applauding, they were watching. Karen felt it. Her posture remained composed, but a small tension had settled into her shoulders. At the side of the auditorium, Daniel Whitmore returned to his seat near Annie and Angela. Angela leaned toward him slightly. "What's happening now?" she asked. Daniel folded his hands calmly. "Now the judges talk." On stage, Karen continued, "Our judges will now take a few minutes to finalize their decisions. We appreciate your patience." She gestured politely toward the front row. 3 judges stood from their table and walked toward a small conference room near the stage. As they passed, one of them glanced briefly toward Annie. It was the same older woman who had leaned forward during Annie's performance. Her eyes softened slightly, then she disappeared through the door with the others. The auditorium buzzed quietly. Parents began whispering, "Who was that violin girl? She was incredible. I thought she opened the program." "She almost didn't," another parent said. Angela heard that last comment and looked down at Annie. Annie sat quietly beside her, swinging her feet gently beneath the chair. Her violin case rested against her knees. She looked up at her mother. "Do we stay now?" she asked. Angela smiled softly. "Yes, sweetheart." Annie nodded. Then she turned to Daniel. "Do judges take a long time?" Daniel chuckled. "Sometimes." "Why?" "Because grown-ups like to argue about things." Annie considered that seriously. "Like when my mom argues with the microwave." Angela laughed. "I do not argue with the microwave." "You did yesterday," Annie said confidently. Daniel smiled. "What did the microwave do?" "It beeped too much." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "That sounds suspicious." Annie giggled. Across the auditorium, Karen Mitchell stood near the stage speaking quietly with another school administrator. Her eyes moved frequently toward the judges' conference room door. Her smile was gone now. Meanwhile, behind the closed door, the judges sat around a small table covered in score sheets. Judge number 1, the older woman with silver hair, adjusted her glasses. "Well," she said, "that was unexpected." A younger judge flipped through his notes. "You mean the Johnson girl?" "Yes, she was excellent." The third judge leaned back in his chair. "I gave her the highest technical score." The younger judge nodded. "So did I." The silver-haired woman folded her hands. "Then we're all seeing the same thing." The third judge frowned slightly. "Then why was her name crossed out in the program?" The room went quiet. The younger judge spoke carefully. "That was odd." The silver-haired judge nodded slowly. "Very odd." She tapped Annie's score sheet. "She has the highest violin score tonight." The younger judge looked surprised. "Higher than Lily Mitchell?" "Yes." The third judge leaned forward. "That's going to be a problem." The silver-haired judge looked up. "For who?" The younger judge sighed. "You know Lily's mother organized this entire event." The silver-haired woman didn't react. "I'm aware." The third judge rubbed his chin. "And the Whitmore Foundation funded it." The room grew quiet again. The younger judge looked at the others. "So what do we do?" The silver-haired judge answered calmly. "We do our job." The younger judge exhaled. "That's going to cause a scene." "Maybe." The silver-haired woman stood slowly. But the scene already happened. She pointed at Annie's score sheet. When someone crossed out a child's name, the other judges said nothing. Outside in the auditorium, Daniel watched the conference room door. Angela noticed. "You think they're arguing?" Daniel smiled slightly. "I think they're deciding how honest they want to be." Angela nodded slowly. Annie tilted her head. "Are they fighting?" Daniel shook his head. "No, they're thinking." Annie seemed relieved. "That's good." Daniel looked at her. "Why?" "Because thinking is quieter." Daniel chuckled softly. Across the room, Lily Mitchell stood near the stage, adjusting her violin strap nervously. Her friends whispered encouragement. "You were amazing." "You're totally winning." Lily smiled, but her eyes kept drifting toward the judge's door. Karen Mitchell approached her daughter. "You did beautifully," she whispered. Lily nodded. "Do you think I'll win?" Karen forced a confident smile. "Of course," but her voice lacked its earlier certainty. At that exact moment, the conference room door opened. The 3 judges stepped out. The room grew quiet. Parents turned toward the stage. Karen straightened her posture instantly and walked back to the microphone. "Thank you all for your patience," she said brightly. "The judges have reached their decisions." Applause rippled through the room. Karen glanced briefly at the judges' papers. Then her smile flickered, just for a second. Daniel saw it. So did Angela. Karen cleared her throat. We'll begin with the category for vocal performance. Several awards were announced. Students walked to the stage. Parents applauded, but the entire room was waiting for one category. Finally, Karen looked down again. And now, she said slowly, our violin division. The room grew very still. Annie looked up at her mother. Angela squeezed her hand gently. Karen read from the paper. Third place. A name was announced. Applause. Second place. Another student. More applause. Karen hesitated before reading the final line. The hesitation lasted less than 2 seconds, but it felt longer. Daniel leaned slightly forward. Angela held her breath. Annie looked up at the stage without moving. Karen's voice came out a little tighter now. And first place. She stopped. Her eyes moved toward the judges. The silver-haired judge gave a small nod. Karen looked back down at the paper. Annie Johnson. For half a second, the room was silent. Then applause exploded across the auditorium. Annie blinked. Once, then twice. She looked at her mother. Mom. Angela was already crying. Yes, sweetheart. You won. Annie looked stunned. But, she glanced toward the stage. I almost didn't play. Daniel smiled quietly. Exactly. Across the stage, Karen Mitchell forced herself to clap, but everyone in the room could see it now. The red line in the program hadn't erased Annie Johnson. It had only made the truth louder, and the night wasn't finished yet. For a moment after the name was announced, Annie Johnson did not move. The applause around her filled the Ridgeway Academy auditorium like a wave rolling across the room. But Annie remained perfectly still in her chair. She looked up at her mother. Angela wiped her eyes quickly, laughing through her tears. Yes, sweetheart, she whispered again. That's your name. Annie blinked. But I thought. She glanced down at the violin case on her lap. I thought maybe I wasn't supposed to play. Daniel Whitmore leaned slightly toward her. That's the funny thing about truth, he said gently. It has a way of showing up anyway. On stage, Karen Mitchell's smile looked like something made of glass, polished, fragile, and very close to cracking. She clapped along with the rest of the audience as Annie's name echoed through the room. But the applause had changed. Earlier in the evening it had been polite. Now it carried something else. Recognition. Parents were turning toward Annie in their seats. Some smiled warmly. Others whispered to each other, That's the girl. The one who almost got skipped. I heard someone crossed her name out. Angela noticed the whispers. She leaned toward Daniel. People know, she said quietly. Daniel nodded. They noticed. Angela looked uneasy. Is that good? Daniel watched the stage calmly. It usually is. Meanwhile, near the stage curtain, Lily Mitchell stood frozen. Her violin hung loosely at her side. One of her friends whispered beside her. What just happened? Lily didn't answer. Her eyes had moved to her mother. Karen stood at the microphone reading the final announcements, but the confidence that had carried her through the evening was gone. The silver-haired judge stepped forward slightly and leaned toward Karen. Invite the winner to the stage, she whispered. Karen's lips tightened, but she nodded. She cleared her throat into the microphone. And now, she said carefully, we'd like to invite Annie Johnson to the stage to receive her award. The audience applauded again. Angela nudged Annie gently. Go on. Annie stood slowly. Her violin case slid from her lap into her hands. She hesitated. Do I bring it? Angela smiled. You should. Daniel leaned back in his seat, watching. Annie walked down the aisle carefully, holding the violin case like something important, because to her, it was. As she reached the stage steps, a teacher offered her a hand. She climbed up onto the stage under the bright lights. The applause continued. From the audience, Daniel noticed something interesting. The judges were standing now. All three of them. They were clapping. Karen Mitchell handed Annie a small trophy and a certificate. Congratulations, Karen said through her tight smile. Annie looked up at her. Thank you. Then Annie did something that no one expected. She asked a question. Did you hear me play? Karen blinked. The microphone was still in Annie's reach, and the question echoed lightly through the speakers. A few people in the audience chuckled softly. Karen forced a small laugh. Yes, Annie. Annie nodded. That's good. She looked relieved, because Annie Johnson had spent most of the evening believing the adults in charge simply hadn't heard her. The silver-haired judge stepped closer to the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, she said warmly, I'd like to say something. Karen stiffened, but she stepped aside. The judge placed a gentle hand on Annie's shoulder. This young musician delivered one of the finest violin performances we've seen at this showcase in years. Applause rose again. The judge continued, and talent deserves opportunity. Her eyes moved briefly toward Karen. No matter when that opportunity arrives. The message was polite, but unmistakable. In the audience, Daniel Whitmore smiled slightly. Angela whispered under her breath, "Oh my goodness." Annie simply looked confused. She leaned toward the microphone again. "My teacher says practice is more important than talent." The audience laughed warmly. The judge smiled. "That teacher sounds wise." Annie nodded. "She's very old." More laughter rippled across the auditorium. The tension in the room began to melt, but not everywhere. Near the stage curtain, Lily Mitchell stared down at the floor. One of her friends tried to whisper encouragement. "You were still amazing." Lily shrugged quietly. "I know," but her voice carried something new. Uncertainty. On stage, Annie held the small trophy carefully with both hands. She looked out into the audience until she spotted her mother. Angela waved. Daniel gave a small nod of encouragement. Annie smiled. The silver-haired judge leaned toward her. "Would you like to say anything?" Annie thought for a moment. Then she leaned toward the microphone. "I almost went home," she said simply. The room went quiet. Annie continued. "But my mom said sometimes you have to wait your turn." She paused, then added, "I just didn't know my turn was still coming." The silence deepened. Not uncomfortable, just honest. Angela felt her throat tighten again. Daniel Whitmore's eyes softened, because the child had just said something many adults spent years trying to learn. The judge squeezed Annie's shoulder gently. "And we're very glad you stayed." The applause that followed was the loudest of the night. But across the stage, Karen Mitchell felt the ground shifting beneath her. Because the story people would remember from this evening was no longer the showcase. It was the girl whose name had almost been erased. And the more people thought about that red line in the program, the more questions would follow. Daniel Whitmore knew it too. As the applause continued, he leaned toward Angela again. "This part," he said quietly, "is where things usually begin." Angela looked nervous. "Begin?" Daniel nodded slowly. "People start asking why. And once that question began moving through a room full of parents, it rarely stopped. The applause faded slowly, but the feeling it left behind stayed in the room. Parents gathered their coats. Children compared trophies. Teachers began guiding students toward the exits. Yet something about the Ridgeway Academy auditorium felt different tonight. Conversations were starting, and they weren't about music. Near the center aisle, two fathers stood talking quietly. "That violin girl," one said. "Annie Johnson," the other replied. "Right. She was the one with the crossed-out name, wasn't she? I saw it in the program." A woman beside them joined the conversation. "My daughter noticed it too." Another parent leaned closer. "Why would they remove her from the list?" The question floated from one small group to another. Across the auditorium, from row to row, exactly the way questions often travel in communities where people know each other well. Angela Johnson noticed it immediately. As Annie climbed down from the stage holding her trophy, 3 different parents smiled at her. "Beautiful performance," one woman said. "You were wonderful," another added. Annie nodded politely. "Thank you." She walked back toward her mother. Angela knelt and hugged her tightly. "You were brave," she whispered. Annie held up the trophy. "It's heavier than it looks." Daniel Whitmore laughed softly from his seat. "That's usually how trophies work." Annie turned toward him. "Do you have a lot of them?" Daniel thought for a moment. "A few. For violin." "No. What for?" "Business." Annie frowned slightly. "That sounds boring." Angela burst out laughing. Daniel grinned. "You're not the first person to say that." Across the room, the judges were gathering their notes. The silver-haired judge approached Annie. "Young lady," she said warmly. "Yes, ma'am," Annie replied. "You should keep playing." Annie nodded. "I will." The judge smiled. "Good." She glanced briefly toward Daniel Whitmore. Recognition passed between them. Daniel nodded politely. Then the judge walked away. Meanwhile, near the stage curtain, Karen Mitchell stood surrounded by 2 school administrators. Her voice was low but tense. "This is getting out of hand," she said. One administrator rubbed his forehead. "Parents are asking questions." Karen crossed her arms. It was a scheduling adjustment. The second administrator sighed. "Karen, what?" "There's a line through the girl's name." Karen looked irritated. So people noticed." Karen turned toward the auditorium. Parents were indeed talking, not loudly, but steadily. The kind of quiet conversations that grow stronger the more people repeat them. Karen spotted Daniel Whitmore standing near Annie and her mother. Her expression hardened. He's the one stirring this up. The first administrator shook his head. Actually, Karen, you might have done that yourself. Karen stared at him. What's that supposed to mean? The administrator lowered his voice. When you crossed out the name, Karen didn't respond, because deep down she knew something uncomfortable. He was right. Across the auditorium, Annie sat back down beside her mother and Daniel. She turned the trophy slowly in her hands. Do winners always get these? Daniel nodded. Usually. Annie looked thoughtful. I almost didn't. Angela squeezed her hand. But you did. Annie looked around the room. People keep looking at me. Daniel smiled. That happens when someone does something impressive. Annie frowned slightly. But I just played the violin. Daniel leaned forward slightly. Sometimes that's enough. Angela glanced toward the stage again. Karen Mitchell was still speaking with the administrators. Angela lowered her voice. Do you think she's angry? Daniel didn't look surprised. Probably. Annie tilted her head. Why? Daniel thought carefully before answering. Because sometimes when the truth shows up, it makes people uncomfortable. Annie considered that. Like broccoli. Daniel chuckled. Exactly like broccoli. At that moment, another parent approached Annie. A tall man with gray hair and a Ridgeway Academy jacket. Excuse me, he said politely. Angela looked up. Yes, I just wanted to say your daughter played beautifully. Angela smiled. Thank you. The man nodded toward Annie. You have real talent. Annie smiled shyly. Thank you. Then the man added something that made the air shift again. My wife noticed the program earlier, he said quietly. Angela's smile faded slightly. Oh, the man shook his head. I hope the school explains that. Daniel watched him carefully. So do I, he said. The man nodded. Then he walked away. Angela exhaled slowly. Daniel, yes, this might turn into something bigger. Daniel looked around the room. Parents were still whispering. Teachers were starting to look uneasy. The administrators were now speaking to two board members who had arrived near the stage. Daniel nodded calmly. It probably will. Angela looked worried. I didn't come here to cause trouble. Daniel's voice softened. You didn't. He glanced down at the program still folded in his pocket. The red line did. Annie looked up at him. What red line? Angela hesitated. Daniel answered gently. The one someone drew across your name. Annie frowned. Why would someone do that? Daniel didn't answer immediately. Because sometimes adults make mistakes, and sometimes those mistakes are not accidents. Angela spoke quietly. We don't know yet. Annie nodded. Then she said something simple. Well, they should erase it. Daniel smiled. That would help. Across the auditorium, Karen Mitchell suddenly noticed something that made her stomach drop. Two members of the Ridgeway Academy board had arrived, and they were walking directly toward her. The taller of the two held a copy of the program in his hand. With Annie Johnson's name crossed out in red, Karen felt the ground beneath her shift again. Because when board members start asking questions, those questions rarely stay small. And tonight, the story of a girl whose name had almost disappeared from the program was only beginning to spread. The conversations in the Ridgeway Academy auditorium had not quieted. If anything, they had grown more focused. Parents were no longer simply congratulating the performers. Small clusters had formed across the room, and the same question kept resurfacing again and again. Why had Annie Johnson's name been crossed out? Near the stage, Karen Mitchell saw the two board members approaching. One of them, Thomas Bradley, had served on the Ridgeway Academy board for nearly 15 years. He was a retired judge with the calm posture of someone who had spent decades listening before speaking. Beside him walked Margaret Lewis, a longtime donor to the school and chair of the Academy's Parent Advisory Council. Both of them held programs in their hands. Both of those programs contained the same red line. Karen forced a polite smile as they reached her. Thomas, Margaret, she said. Wonderful event tonight, isn't it? Thomas Bradley looked down at the paper in his hand. It was, he said evenly. Then he lifted the program slightly. Until we noticed this. Karen's smile stiffened. Oh, that. Margaret Lewis studied her carefully. Yes, she said. That. Karen let out a small breath. It was simply a scheduling adjustment. Thomas didn't react. He had spent too many years in courtrooms to be satisfied with the first answer someone gave. An adjustment, he repeated. Karen nodded quickly. Yes. The program order changed during rehearsal. Margaret glanced at the stage where Annie still stood talking to one of the judges. "The girl won first place," Margaret said. Karen hesitated. "Yes." Thomas looked at the red line again. "Then the adjustment seems unusual." Karen felt the pressure building. "Well, sometimes students aren't ready." Margaret's eyebrows lifted slightly. "She sounded ready to me." Karen said nothing. Thomas folded the program slowly. "Karen," he said calmly, "let me ask you something very directly." Karen forced another smile. "Of course. Who crossed out this name?" Karen's fingers tightened around her clipboard. "I did." The admission hung in the air. Margaret glanced at Thomas. Thomas nodded once. "And why?" Karen felt heat creeping into her face. "I believed the performance order needed to be revised." Margaret tilted her head, but only one name was crossed out. Karen didn't respond. Thomas's voice remained steady. "Was the judging panel informed?" Karen hesitated again. "No." Margaret folded her arms. "So the judges believed she was always scheduled to perform?" Karen nodded reluctantly. "Yes." Margaret exhaled. "That's troubling." Karen quickly defended herself. "She still performed." Thomas nodded. "Yes." He paused. "But not because of the program." Karen followed his gaze. Across the auditorium, Daniel Whitmore stood beside Angela and Annie. Karen's jaw tightened. Thomas noticed the look. "Mr. Whitmore seems interested in the situation." Karen's voice sharpened. "He interfered." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "He asked questions." Karen crossed her arms. "Exactly." Thomas gave a faint smile. "That tends to happen when something unusual appears in writing." Karen said nothing. Margaret looked toward Annie again. "She's talented." "Yes," Karen said reluctantly. Margaret spoke quietly. "Then why remove her?" Karen's patience finally cracked. "Because this is a structured event." Thomas remained calm. "Meaning?" Karen exhaled sharply. "There are expectations." Margaret looked puzzled. "Expectations?" Karen's voice lowered. "Families donate. Students represent the school. Certain performers help maintain our reputation." Thomas studied her face carefully. "And Annie Johnson doesn't represent the school well?" Karen quickly shook her head. "That's not what I meant." Margaret's voice cooled. "Then what did you mean?" Karen looked toward the stage again. Lily stood there talking quietly with her friends. Karen hesitated. Thomas noticed immediately. "You have a daughter in the competition," he said. Karen stiffened. "Yes." Margaret's eyes widened slightly. "And she plays violin." Karen didn't answer. Because she didn't have to. Thomas Bradley had spent 30 years reading people. The silence was enough. He nodded slowly. "I see." Karen's voice grew defensive. "That has nothing to do with it." Margaret gave her a long look. "Are you certain?" Karen didn't respond. Across the auditorium, the silver-haired judge approached Daniel Whitmore. They spoke quietly. Angela and Annie stood nearby. Margaret followed their gaze. "The foundation that funded this event belongs to Mr. Whitmore," she said. Thomas nodded. "I'm aware." Karen felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. Margaret looked back at her. "Karen, do you understand how this appears?" Karen tried to answer, but nothing came out. Thomas spoke calmly. "A student's name was crossed out without informing the judges." Margaret added, "That student then won first place." Thomas continued, "And the organizer's daughter was competing in the same category." The silence that followed was heavy. Karen whispered, "I was protecting the program." Thomas shook his head gently. "No." He looked down at the program again. "You were protecting something else." Karen closed her eyes briefly. Across the room, Annie laughed at something Angela had said. The sound carried lightly through the auditorium. Margaret watched the girl for a moment. "She seems like a good kid." Karen's voice was quiet now. "She is." Thomas folded the program again and placed it in his jacket. "This situation will need to be reviewed." Karen looked up quickly. "Reviewed?" Margaret nodded. "Yes." Karen's voice tightened. "You're going to open an investigation?" Thomas answered calmly. "We're going to ask questions." Karen felt the floor shifting beneath her again. "But the event is over." Margaret gave a small, firm smile. "That's usually when the real conversations begin." Across the auditorium, Daniel Whitmore watched the board members speaking with Karen. Angela followed his gaze. "What are they saying?" Daniel shook his head slightly. "I can't hear." Annie looked up at him. "Are they talking about the red line?" Daniel smiled. "Probably." Annie nodded thoughtfully. "Good." Angela looked down at her. "Why good?" Annie answered simply. "Because it shouldn't be there." Daniel looked at her quietly. Sometimes children understood fairness faster than adults ever did. Across the room, Karen Mitchell stood very still as the board members walked away from her, because she knew something now. The red line in the program had been meant to erase a moment. Instead, it had created a much bigger one. And the story of Annie Johnson was no longer just about a violin performance. It had become a question about fairness. And once a school community starts asking that question, it rarely stops. The Ridgeway Academy auditorium had begun to empty. Students carried instruments toward the exits. Parents gathered coats and purses. Teachers stacked folding chairs along the walls. But near the center of the room, the evening was far from over. Clusters of parents still stood talking, and the same quiet question continued moving from group to group. Why was Annie Johnson's name crossed out? Angela Johnson felt the attention when she walked with Annie toward the exit aisle. Henceforth, people smiled warmly at them. Your daughter was wonderful. That was a beautiful performance. Angela thanked them politely, but she could also feel the curiosity beneath the compliments. Across the room, Daniel Whitmore stood with the silver-haired judge and one of the board members, Thomas Bradley. Their conversation was calm but serious. Annie noticed. She tugged gently at her mother's sleeve. Mom. Yes? Are the grown-ups still thinking? Angela followed Annie's gaze. Daniel and the board members were still talking. Yes, she said softly. I think they are. Annie nodded approvingly. That's good. Angela smiled faintly. Meanwhile, near the stage, Karen Mitchell stood alone. The administrators who had been speaking with her earlier had stepped away. Now several members of the Ridgeway Academy board had gathered near the judge's table. Karen could see them speaking with Daniel Whitmore. Every few seconds someone glanced toward her. She knew exactly what that meant. The conversation was about her. Thomas Bradley finally approached Daniel directly. Mr. Whitmore, he said calmly. Daniel extended his hand politely. Judge Bradley. Thomas smiled slightly. I'm retired, but the title tends to follow me around. Daniel nodded. It usually does. Margaret Lewis joined them. We appreciate your support of tonight's event, she said. Daniel gave a small smile. It's a pleasure to support young musicians. Thomas looked toward Annie across the auditorium. She certainly deserved the opportunity. Daniel followed his gaze. Yes. Thomas studied Daniel carefully. You noticed the program earlier? Daniel nodded. I did. Margaret folded her arms thoughtfully. Did Annie notice it too? Daniel shook his head. No. He paused. She thought everyone else was being called first. Margaret's expression softened. Thomas looked down briefly at the program still in his hand. The board will be reviewing this situation, he said. Daniel nodded once. I assumed you would. Thomas studied him again. You didn't raise your voice tonight. Daniel smiled faintly. That rarely helps. Margaret chuckled. That's true. Thomas asked one more question. Why did you step in? Daniel looked toward Annie again. She was laughing quietly while Angela fixed a loose string on the violin case. Then Daniel answered simply, because she believed she didn't belong on the stage. Thomas nodded slowly. That's a powerful moment for a child. Daniel's voice remained calm, and a dangerous one. Margaret understood immediately. Yes, she said quietly. Those moments stay with people. Across the auditorium, Karen Mitchell watched the conversation unfold. Every word between Daniel and the board members made her more uneasy, because she understood something now. Daniel Whitmore had not tried to embarrass her. He had simply refused to ignore the situation, and that was much harder to defend against. A few minutes later, Thomas Bradley approached Karen again. Karen, he said gently. Karen straightened. Yes? Margaret stood beside him. We're going to schedule a formal review with the board. Karen's voice tightened. A review? Thomas nodded. Yes. Karen crossed her arms. This was a small scheduling decision. Margaret shook her head slowly. No. She lifted the program. This was a decision that affected a child. Karen felt the words land heavily. Thomas continued calmly. We need to understand how it happened. Karen's voice lowered. You think I did it intentionally? Thomas answered carefully. We think we need answers. Karen looked toward the auditorium again. Parents were still talking. Teachers were beginning to leave. But Annie Johnson still stood near the aisle holding her trophy. And every now and then another parent stopped to congratulate her. Karen closed her eyes briefly, because the moment she had tried to control had grown far beyond her reach. Across the room, Annie walked back toward Daniel. Mr. Whitmore? Yes? She held up the small trophy. Do you think my teacher will be proud? Daniel smiled warmly. I'm certain of it. Annie nodded happily. Angela looked at Daniel. You didn't have to stay this long. Daniel shrugged lightly. I like seeing how stories end. Angela glanced toward the board members, speaking again with Karen. I'm not sure this one is finished. Daniel followed her gaze. You're right. He looked back at Annie. Some stories take a little longer. Annie tilted her head. Like when my grandma tells stories? Daniel chuckled. Yes, those take forever. Angela laughed. Across the auditorium, Thomas Bradley watched Annie for a moment. Then he turned to Margaret. That girl handled herself well. Margaret nodded. She did. Thomas looked toward Karen again, which makes the decision to remove her even harder to explain. Margaret folded her arms. The board will expect honesty. Thomas agreed. Yes, because Ridgeway Academy had built its reputation on fairness, opportunity, and community trust. And tonight, one red line across a program had raised questions about all three. Near the exit doors, Annie suddenly stopped walking. Mom? Angela looked down. Yes. Next year can I play again? Angela smiled. I think that would be a wonderful idea. Annie looked at Daniel. Will you come watch again? Daniel considered the question seriously. I think I will. Annie nodded happily. Good. She paused. And next time I hope my name is still there. Daniel looked down at her. It will be. Because by the time Ridgeway Academy held another showcase, everyone in that building would remember exactly what happened the night Annie Johnson almost disappeared from the program. And no one would ever want to see a red line like that again. 2 weeks later, the Ridgeway Academy auditorium looked very different. The bright stage lights were off. The violin stands and microphones were gone. Rows of chairs had been arranged neatly facing a long table at the front of the room. It was not a concert tonight. It was a meeting. Parents filled most of the seats, speaking quietly among themselves while members of the school board organized documents at the front table. The atmosphere carried a calm seriousness that often appears when a community understands something important must be addressed. Angela Johnson sat near the middle row. Annie sat beside her, swinging her feet slightly above the floor. Her violin case rested on her lap again. Not because she was performing, because Annie had insisted on bringing it. Just in case, she had said earlier. Angela smiled at the memory. Across the room, Daniel Whitmore entered quietly and took a seat a few rows behind them. Several parents recognized him now. A few nodded respectfully. Daniel returned the nods politely, but he kept his attention on the front of the room, because the meeting was about to begin. At exactly 7 o'clock, Thomas Bradley stood from his chair. The quiet conversations in the room faded. Good evening, he said calmly. Thank you all for coming. Thomas had the steady voice of someone used to speaking in rooms where people expected fairness. As many of you know, he continued, the Ridgeway Academy Board conducted a review following the Student Talent Showcase 2 weeks ago. Several parents shifted in their seats. They knew exactly what he meant. Thomas lifted a copy of the same program that had circulated through the auditorium that night. The red line was still visible across one name. During that event, he said, a student's name was removed from the printed performance order. The room remained silent. Thomas continued, the board spoke with faculty members, event organizers, judges, and several parents who were present. Margaret Lewis sat beside him, reviewing notes. Thomas glanced down briefly before speaking again. Our findings confirmed that the change was made without informing the judging panel and without approval from the school administration. A few murmurs spread quietly through the audience. Angela felt Annie shift slightly beside her. What's he talking about? Annie whispered. Angela squeezed her hand gently. They're explaining what happened. Thomas looked out across the room. This action did not reflect the values Ridgeway Academy holds for fairness and opportunity. Karen Mitchell sat near the front row. Her posture was straight, but her hands rested quietly in her lap. Thomas continued calmly. Mrs. Karen Mitchell has stepped down from her role as event coordinator and PTA chair. The room remained quiet, not angry, not triumphant, just thoughtful. Margaret spoke next. Events at Ridgeway Academy will now follow new guidelines to ensure transparency in judging and performance selection. She smiled gently. No student's opportunity will ever again depend on someone quietly crossing out a name. Across the room, Annie looked up at her mother. That's about the red line, she whispered. Angela nodded softly. Yes. Annie thought about that for a moment. Then she whispered again. So they erased it? Angela smiled. Yes, sweetheart, they did. At the front of the room, Thomas looked down at his notes one last time. There is one more thing, he said. He looked toward the audience. Tonight, we would also like to recognize the student whose performance reminded this community why these events exist. Several parents already knew the name that was coming. Thomas smiled warmly. Annie Johnson. The room filled with gentle applause. Annie blinked in surprise. Angela nudged her softly. That's you. Annie stood slowly. She didn't walk to the stage this time. She simply turned toward the room. Thomas continued. Talent should never be hidden. Margaret added kindly. And courage deserves recognition. The applause grew stronger. Across the room, Daniel Whitmore clapped quietly. Not because Annie had won a competition, but because she had helped an entire school remember something important. When the applause faded, Annie sat down again. She leaned toward her mother. Mom? Yes. Can I still play violin next year? Angela smiled. I hope you play it for a very long time. Annie nodded. That's good. Then she turned slightly and spotted Daniel sitting behind them. She waved. Daniel waved back. After the meeting ended, parents slowly began leaving the auditorium. Several stopped to speak with Angela. Your daughter inspired a lot of people. She handled herself beautifully. Angela thanked them warmly, but Annie was already walking toward Daniel. Mr. Whitmore? Yes, Annie. She held her violin case proudly. My teacher says if you practice long enough, music can change how people feel. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. I believe she's right. Annie tilted her head. Did my music change something? Daniel looked around the auditorium. Parents were leaving. Teachers were smiling. Board members were shaking hands. And the program with the red line had quietly disappeared from the table. Yes, he said gently. I think it did. Annie smiled. Good. She thought for a moment, then asked, Do you think the school will remember? Daniel looked toward the stage where the meeting had just ended. Then he looked back at Annie. I think they will. Because sometimes the most important lessons in a school don't come from a classroom. They come from a quiet moment when a child refuses to believe she doesn't belong, and a community decides to listen. Annie Johnson had come to Ridgeway Academy that night with a violin, a program, and a name someone tried to erase. She left with something much stronger, her music, her voice, and the knowledge that, when fairness matters, sometimes all it takes to change a room is the courage to stay and play. And that is where the story gently ends. This story reminds us that fairness often depends on the courage of people who refuse to look away. A single decision like crossing out a child's name can quietly take away someone's opportunity and confidence. But when someone chooses to stand up for what is right, even in a calm and respectful way, truth has a chance to be heard. Annie's story teaches us that talent deserves opportunity, children deserve dignity, and adults carry the responsibility to protect both. Sometimes justice does not arrive with anger or noise. It arrives through patience, honesty, and the simple courage to make sure no one is left outside the gate. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.